Something enormous is unfolding right now, and most Americans have no idea how deep this actually goes. We are 17 days into a full-scale war against Iran, a war that began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched what they called Operation Epic Fury, and what the world is watching unfold is not simply a military campaign, it is a geopolitical earthquake. The supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, is dead. His son has been put in his place. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil trade typically passes, is being choked off by Iranian retaliation, and daily oil exports from the Gulf have collapsed by at least 60%. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is standing in the middle of this chaos, pressing every button he can find, demanding allies step up, and most of them are simply looking the other way. But here is what nobody is talking about clearly enough. While America carries the weight of this war, other powers, Russia, China, Turkey, are quietly repositioning themselves on the global chessboard in ways that will outlast every bomb dropped on Tehran. The disorder that Washington helped create is now becoming the single greatest strategic opportunity the multipolar world has ever been handed. And if you want to understand where this world is actually heading, you have to understand what is happening right now. Behind the headlines, underneath the noise, in the corridors of power that most news cameras never reach. The 2026 Iran war began on the 28th of February when the United States and Israel launched surprise airstrikes on multiple sites and cities across Iran, killing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and numerous other senior officials. Think about what that sentence actually means for a moment. The leader of a major nation-state was killed in a coordinated strike, not a proxy. Not a general, the supreme leader himself, and Iran did not collapse. The attacks came when the Iranian regime was arguably at its weakest point for some years. Extensive protests in early 2026, motivated by a weakened economy and struggling infrastructure, had illustrated the regime's weakened legitimacy within the country, and those protests were put down with extensive use of force. So here is the picture that was forming before February 28th. A government under severe internal pressure, a population that had been protesting in the streets, an economy that had been strangled by years of sanctions, and a military that had already been hit hard during the 12-day war in June 2025. By every visible metric, this was a regime teetering, and the decision was made to push it over the edge. But what has happened since tells a completely different story than the one that Washington expected. Iran did not fold. Instead, it did exactly what historically besieged nations do. It fought back with what it had left, and it weaponized the one thing it controlled that the entire world depended on: geography. Iran's ability to threaten slow-moving oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz has become a serious headache for the Trump administration, as it creates a stranglehold on a passageway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil trade typically passes. That is not a footnote. That is the central economic story of this war, and it is one that America is paying for at the gas pump, in the grocery store, and across every supply chain that touches the global economy. The Hormuz blockade is the Iranian regime's last remaining strategic weapon, and they have used it with devastating precision. Now the US-Israeli war with Iran is moving into its third week, with no plan announced for a ceasefire, and gas prices in the United States have soared. Think about that for a second. 3 weeks in, no ceasefire, no exit strategy, no articulated endgame that anyone in the administration has been able to coherently explain. Trump and his administration have offered inconsistent and various explanations for the war's strategic objectives: to ward off an imminent Iranian threat, to preempt Iranian retaliation after an expected Israeli attack, to destroy Iran's missile and military capabilities, to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, to secure Iran's natural resources, and to achieve regime change by bringing the Iranian opposition to power. Pick one. You cannot have all of those simultaneously. And the incoherence at the top is something that rival powers have noticed immediately and are now exploiting with quiet, methodical precision. Joe Kent, the director of the U.S. National Counterterrorism Center, resigned from his post, writing publicly that he could not in good conscience support the war, which is now in its third week. In his resignation letter, Kent stated plainly that Iran posed no imminent threat to the United States and that it was clear the country had started this war due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. That is not a fringe voice, that is the man who was running the National Counterterrorism Center. When someone at that level walks away and puts his reasons in writing for the public to read, that is a signal that something very wrong is happening at the decision-making level of American power, and yet the war continues. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer went to the Senate floor and accused Trump of flailing when it comes to strategy, asking pointedly how the president could simultaneously claim that Iranian leaders wanted to make a deal and then in the next moment say that all their leaders were dead, and which version was actually true. That is not partisan bickering. That is a fundamental question about whether the people running this war have any coherent understanding of the enemy they are fighting or the outcome they are seeking. And while Washington argues with itself, Moscow is working. Russia has emerged from the first week of the US-Israeli attacks on Iran as an early winner, seemingly able to profit from the secondary economic and geopolitical effects of the war, while others bear the costs. This is not accidental. This is the product of years of patient strategic positioning. Russia has something America never seems to fully appreciate until it is too late: a long-term strategic vision that does not reset every 4 years with a new election cycle. Putin watches, he calculates, and then he moves. Russia provided intelligence support to Iran, including data on US military positions, while China focused on diplomatic mediation and limited material assistance such as spare parts for missiles. Analysts describe these contributions as enabling Iran to sustain its defenses without escalating to a broader confrontation involving Moscow or Beijing directly. So here is what that means in plain language. Russia is feeding Iran just enough to keep it fighting while keeping its own hands visibly clean. That is a masterclass in proxy leverage. Moscow gets the benefit of American overextension without firing a single Russian bullet. The geopolitical landscape could shift further in Russia's favor if Moscow manages to present itself as a mediator in the crisis. Russian leaders have previously offered to facilitate negotiations between Iran and Western powers over Tehran's nuclear program, and a prolonged war could reopen that possibility. Such a role would allow the Kremlin to portray itself as an indispensable power broker in global security. Imagine that. America starts a war, bleeds money and political capital fighting it, alienates its NATO partners, drives up global oil prices, and Russia steps in at the end as the peacemaker. History is full of these reversals, and they always happen when the dominant power mistakes military strength for strategic wisdom. Iran's foreign minister openly stated that Russia and China are providing military cooperation to Tehran during the war, emphasizing that these relationships are part of long-standing strategic partnerships that now include intelligence sharing and other forms of support as the conflict escalates. The acknowledgement alone is significant. It means Beijing and Moscow are no longer hiding their alignment. They have decided that the moment calls for clarity, not concealment. For China, the calculus is more complex and in some ways more painful. China's entire Middle Eastern architecture has suffered a serious blow. As shockwaves radiate from Tehran, Beijing faces the immediate fracturing of its energy security, the collapse of its defense exports, and the rupture of its Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI was never just a trade project, it was China's long game, a way to build a Eurasian land corridor that bypassed Western-controlled sea routes and gave Beijing direct economic access from East Asia to Europe. Iran was the keystone of that corridor. The strikes on Iranian infrastructure, particularly the port of Bandar Abbas, threatened to collapse the international north-south transport corridor and the Belt and Road Initiative, which Russia and China rely on to bypass Western-controlled maritime routes. So when you hear people say China has nothing to do with this war, understand that China has everything at stake. A $400 billion strategic partnership with Iran, signed in 2021, covering energy, telecommunications, and transit infrastructure, all of it now sitting in the rubble of a war China neither supported nor could stop. And yet China's response has been measured, not panicked. Beijing condemned the strikes, yes. It called for ceasefire, yes. But what it has quietly been doing is using the chaos to reframe itself globally. Trump on Saturday called on China, France, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom and others to send warships to the Strait of Hormuz, and China said nothing. No ships, no enthusiastic response. Because China understands something Trump apparently does not. You do not help your strategic rival win the war he started. Every day that American military and economic resources are consumed in the Persian Gulf is a day that China consolidates its position in the South China Sea, deepens its relationships in Africa and Southeast Asia, and builds out the next phase of its technological dominance. Washington's attention is finite. Beijing is banking on that. EU foreign ministers decided against expanding their naval operations around the Strait of Hormuz, even as President Donald Trump criticized allies who rebuffed his demands for assistance in reopening the critical waterway. Germany, Italy, Spain, none of them joining. The Atlantic alliance that America built over 80 years is showing fractures that no amount of presidential pressure can paper over. European allies, including Germany, Italy, and Spain, said they would not participate in the war against Iran, even as Trump said numerous countries had told him they were on the way. There is a profound gap between what Trump is saying publicly and what is actually happening diplomatically. That gap is the space in which other powers operate, and they are operating in it aggressively. Consider Turkey. Turkey and Iran are historic competitors who share a nearly 400-year-old border. Ankara has opposed Tehran's bid to acquire nuclear weapons because this would upend their age-old parity and expose Turkey to direct Iranian threats. At the same time, Ankara does not want to see Iran disintegrate, in part because such a collapse could result in regional chaos and another massive flow of refugees toward Turkey. Turkey is in a position that Washington rarely thinks about carefully. A NATO member that borders Iran, that has strategic relationships with Russia, that has its own regional ambitions, and that is watching this war create a power vacuum along its eastern border. Erdogan is not going to commit to anything that does not serve Turkish interests. And Turkish interests right now include a stable Iran, not a shattered one that sends another refugee wave westward and empowers Kurdish militant groups along the Iranian border. The prospects of regime collapse followed by chaos, civil war, instability spilling over into neighboring countries, and refugee flows is of potentially far greater concern to the United States and its Arab partners than to Israel. This is the central tension at the heart of this war that nobody in Washington has publicly resolved. Israel's goals and American goals are not identical. Israel wants to permanently eliminate the Iranian military and nuclear threat. America, if it is thinking strategically, should want a stable Middle East that does not become a black hole for American resources. Those two goals are not the same, and if a gap between Israeli and US goals opens up, Trump will be the one who determines when the war ends and who imposes that endpoint on Israel. That is a moment that has not yet arrived, but it is coming. And when it does, the entire political dynamic of this conflict will shift in ways that are currently impossible to predict. The economic confidence model has identified 2026 as a pivot year, with pressure building into 2027, where the probability of sudden geopolitical escalation rises, and the cycle then carrying forward into the 2028 panic cycle year. When these cycles align, history shows that global alliances restructure and the world moves toward a new balance of power. Whether or not you follow cyclical economic modeling, the underlying observation is sound. We are living through a restructuring. The post-Cold War order, the one built on American unipolarity, dollar dominance, and the assumption that Washington's military supremacy would deter challengers, that order is being stress-tested in real time, and the test is revealing weaknesses that were always there but rarely visible. The oil market tells the story more honestly than any politician ever will. Crude, condensate, and refined fuel exports from 8 Middle Eastern countries dropped to 9.71 million barrels per day in the week ending March 15th, down 61% from 25.13 million barrels per day in February. That is not a market disruption, that is a market catastrophe. The Gulf region alone accounted for 36% of all global seaborne oil exports before this war began. When more than half of that disappears in 3 weeks, the ripple effects move through every economy on Earth, from the price of heating oil in Minnesota to the cost of manufacturing in Vietnam. And here is what makes this so strategically dangerous for Washington. Russia is exempt from all of it. Russia sells its oil through pipelines and routes that bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely. Every dollar that oil prices rise is a dollar going into the Russian state treasury. The war in Iran has killed hundreds of civilians, displaced hundreds of thousands, sent global oil prices skyrocketing, created a political crisis for President Donald Trump, and shaken the stability of the Gulf. But for Russia, the chaos has created opportunity. That sentence should be read slowly. Russia is winning, not militarily, not by fighting, but strategically, economically, and diplomatically. Russia is winning this war, it is not fighting. That is the kind of strategic sophistication that empires build over centuries. And it is the kind of sophistication that transactional foreign policy, the kind that responds to pressure from lobbyists and allies rather than long-term national interest, simply cannot match. Moscow and Beijing have transitioned from diplomatic allies to technological anchors, providing Iran with advanced air defense systems, fighters, and navigation technology to negate Western stealth and jamming capabilities. These are not acts of friendship. These are calculated investments in prolonging American overextension. Every day this war continues, every $1 billion spent, every barrel of oil choked off at Hormuz, that is a dividend paid on the investment that Moscow and Beijing made in keeping Iran armed and capable. The deeper question, the one that Americans paying $5 a gallon for gas are not being asked to think about, is what kind of world comes after this? From the macro perspective of great power competition, the ongoing neutralization of Iran signals a profound strategic pivot for Washington, but over the past 20 years, the Middle East has functioned as a massive strategic quagmire, tethering US attention and resources. The irony is almost unbearable. America spends blood and treasure to dominate the Middle East, and in doing so, it frees up the rest of the world for its competitors to shape. While the Pentagon is focused on Tehran, Beijing is building infrastructure in Africa. While the State Department is managing Gulf crises, Moscow is consolidating influence in what was once the Soviet near abroad. The geography of power is being redrawn, and the cartographers are not in Washington. What comes next is genuinely uncertain. Israel says it plans at least 3 more weeks of war. A second front in the war is heating up, with new Israeli ground operations in neighboring Lebanon. The conflict is expanding, not contracting, and Trump, who promised to end wars rather than start them, now finds himself presiding over the most significant American military engagement since Iraq, one that carries far greater regional spillover risk, one that has isolated key allies, one that has handed Russia a strategic gift, and one that has no clear exit ramp. The pressure is real, the stakes are enormous, and the rival nations circling this chaos are not going to stop positioning themselves just because Washington eventually decides it has had enough. The world is changing right now, not in some distant future, not in some theoretical policy paper, but today, on March 17th, 2026, with every missile fired, every tanker turned away, and every allied leader who quietly declines Trump's phone call. This is the moment, and whether America navigates it with wisdom or stumbles through it with bravado will determine who leads the next era of global order and who simply gets left behind.